You are standing in the produce aisle of your local grocery store, reaching for a bunch of bright green kale. It's a mundane, almost mindless act. You don't check for a certificate of safety, and you certainly don't wonder if this specific bunch of greens is going to shut down your nervous system before you finish your dinner. You trust the system. You trust the labels. You trust that the world has already been sorted into edible and lethal. But if you take that same kale and place it in the hands of an ancestor from 200,000 years ago, the scene shifts from a chore to a life-or-death gamble. To them, that kale looks hauntingly similar to several species of wild hemlock or nightshade that could stop a human heart in under an hour. There were no labels in the Pleistocene. There were no plastic bags or safety regulations. There was only a vast green, indifferent wilderness where the difference between a life-saving calorie and a final meal was often a matter of a few millimeters in leaf shape. It is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of our species' history. How did we, a creature with no innate biological map of the botanical world, manage to categorize thousands of plants across every continent without accidentally wiping ourselves out in the process? We like to imagine that ancient humans possessed a mystical, deep-rooted nature instinct that allowed them to just feel whether a berry was safe. This is a comforting thought, suggesting we were once perfectly in tune with the earth. However, the forensic evidence from our earliest ancestors suggests this is a complete fabrication. We weren't born with a guidebook, we were born into a botanical minefield. Thousands of plants produce alkaloids, glycosides, and tannins specifically designed to kill anything that tries to eat them. Nature isn't a garden, it's a chemical arms race. So the investigation begins. How did we crack the code? If it wasn't instinct, was it something more calculated? Was there a systematic process, a prehistoric FDA, that allowed us to move from being terrified scavengers to the masters of the global menu? The answer isn't found in a single discovery, but in a series of clues left behind in our DNA, our psychology, and our most ancient traditions. It seems logical to assume that our ancestors simply used their superior intelligence to observe the world and make rational choices. We often hear the advice that if you're ever lost in the woods, you should just eat what the monkeys or the birds are eating. It's a classic survival trope. If a macaque can gorge itself on a particular fruit without dropping dead, surely a human can too. This looks like the first smoking gun in our investigation, the idea that we simply outsourced our safety testing to the local wildlife. It's a clean, efficient theory that explains how we could move into new environments and immediately find the local staples. But that theory falls apart the moment you look at the actual biochemistry of digestion. In reality, following the lead of animals is one of the most dangerous things a prehistoric human could have done. Evolution has spent millions of years fine-tuning the livers and stomachs of different species to handle specific toxins. A squirrel can eat mushrooms that would melt a human's liver into a toxic sludge. Birds can eat berries that contain enough atropine to cause a person's heart to seize. Many primates have specialized gut bacteria and elongated digestive tracts that neutralize compounds that are strictly lethal to us. To an ancient human, watching a bird eat a berry wasn't a green light. It was a distraction. If our ancestors had relied solely on mimicry, the human story would have ended in a mass poisoning event long before we ever learned to sharpen a stone. So, if animal mimicry was a death trap, we have to look for a more reliable clue. This leads us to the internal equipment we carry with us every day. We often think of our sense of taste as a way to enjoy food, but its original function was far more utilitarian. It was a chemical sensor. Specifically, we need to talk about bitterness. Most of the deadliest toxins in the plant world, alkaloids like strychnine or nicotine, and cyanogenic glycosides share a common trait. They are intensely overwhelmingly bitter. Humans possess a family of about 25 different bitter taste receptors, known to scientists as the TAS2R family. This isn't just a random quirk of our biology. It is a highly specialized alarm system. A landmark study in 2013 by geneticist Sarah Tishkoff revealed that these receptors are incredibly ancient, with some mutations dating back over 1 million years. This means that long before we were modern humans, we were already walking around with a biological laboratory in our mouths. We have evolved to be super tasters for the specific types of bitterness that signal danger. This is why a toddler will instinctively spit out a piece of broccoli or a dark leafy green with a look of pure betrayal. It's not that they're being picky, it's that their TAS2R receptors are firing a high-level warning that says, "Warning tokens, name potential alkaloid detected." As adults, we learn to override this signal for things like coffee or kale. But for an ancient forager, that initial yuck reflex was the first line of defense. It allowed them to test a plant with a tiny nibble, getting the warning signal before they ingested a lethal dose. However, the bitter equals poison rule is far from perfect. If it were that simple, the mystery would be solved. But some of the most nutritious foods in the world are bitter, and some of the most lethal substances are deceptively pleasant. For instance, The death cap mushroom doesn't taste like a chemical warning. It is reportedly quite delicious, with a mild nutty flavor. It won't trigger your TAS2R receptors, but it will certainly kill you. This is where the investigation takes a psychological turn. If our tongues couldn't catch everything, our brains had to develop a second layer of defense. Actually, our primary defense wasn't just taste, it was a deep-seated psychological phobia. Researchers Annie Wirtz and Karen Wynn at Yale University conducted a fascinating series of experiments with 18-month-old toddlers. They showed the children a variety of objects. Some were man-made toys, some were natural objects like rocks or shells, and some were plants. The results were startlingly consistent. Even at that young age, children were significantly more hesitant to touch the plants than any other object. They would wait for an adult to give them a social cue, a nod of approval, or a demonstration, before they would interact with the vegetation. This suggests that humans are born with a plant-specific social learning module. We don't just learn what is safe by trying it, we are hardwired to wait for a teacher. This is a phenomenon known as food neophobia, the fear of the new. It's an evolutionary brake system. In the wild, curiosity kills, but caution keeps you alive long enough to have children. This psychological clue tells us that the knowledge of what was safe wasn't something each individual discovered on their own, it was a communal asset. It was a library of safety that had to be maintained and passed down with absolute precision. But even with taste and caution, there is a massive gap in our investigation. How do you explain foods like cassava? Cassava is a primary calorie source for over 800 million people today, particularly in the tropics. It's a hearty, reliable root. It is also, in its raw state, a chemical weapon. Cassava contains high levels of cyanogenic glycosides, which release pure cyanide when they are chewed or digested. If an ancient human simply found a cassava root and ate it, they would suffer from acute cyanide poisoning. Chronic exposure leads to a devastating neurological condition called konzo, which causes permanent paralysis of the legs. This is where the mystery becomes truly mind-bending. Our ancestors didn't just figure out that cassava was dangerous and avoid it. They figured out how to perform complex chemical engineering on it. To make cassava safe, you have to peel it, grate it, soak it in water for days, and then ferment or boil it. This multi-step process breaks down the cyanide-producing compounds and leaches them away. There is no way to stumble upon this process by accident. You can't just take a bite and realize you need to soak it for 72 hours. So how did they know? The answer lies in a process of iterative survival. This is the brutal reality of the investigation. The map of safe food wasn't drawn with a pen. It was drawn with the lives of those who failed. This is the part of the story that we often gloss over in our romanticized view of the past. For every successful food processing technique we have today, there were likely thousands of individuals who got it slightly wrong. They soaked the root for 2 days instead of 3. They forgot to peel the skin. They used the wrong kind of fire. We see this same pattern in the way indigenous North American cultures processed acorns. Raw acorns are packed with tannins that will cause severe kidney damage and gastrointestinal distress. To make them edible, ancient peoples developed a system of leaching, where they would grind the acorns into a meal and pour water through it repeatedly until the bitter tannins were washed away. This wasn't a discovery made in an afternoon. It was the result of generations of collective observation. They noticed that acorns sitting in a stream were less bitter than those on the ground. They noticed that some people got sick while others didn't. They distilled these observations into rigid, ritualistic instructions. You must wash the meal until the water runs clear. These weren't suggestions. They were the laws of the species. But even the most meticulous rituals can't explain everything. There's a missing piece to this puzzle, a central hard drive where all this information was stored before we had written language. If we are investigating how we stayed safe, we have to look at who was doing the teaching. In almost every traditional foraging society, there is a specific demographic responsible for the majority of the botanical knowledge: the grandmothers. Anthropologists have long noted the grandmother hypothesis, which suggests that the reason human women live long past their reproductive years is to serve as a repository of survival information. While the younger, faster members of the tribe were out hunting high-risk, high-reward animals, the older women were the ones who knew the secrets of the plants. They knew which tuber looked like a poisonous root but was actually safe. They knew the exact week that a certain berry became ripe and its toxin levels dropped. They were the ones who enforced the social cues that the Yale researchers identified in toddlers. This was the oldest library in the world, a living, breathing database of chemical knowledge. If a grandmother told a child never to touch a specific red berry, that child didn't need to understand the molecular structure of the toxins inside. They just needed to fear the grandmother's warning, more than they craved the berry's color. This cultural transmission allowed us to bypass the slow process of biological evolution. We didn't have to wait for our livers to evolve a resistance to cyanide. We just had to pass down the recipe for cassava flour. This is the ultimate hack that allowed humans to take over the planet. We are the only species that can transform a toxic landscape into a buffet through the power of collective memory. Actually focusing only on the successes of our ancestors gives us a warped view of the mystery. It makes it seem like we were masters of the environment. But the truth revealed by modern archaeology is much darker. When we look at the bones of our ancestors, we don't just see signs of hunting accidents or warfare. We see the silent evidence of the trials that didn't go well. We see evidence of stunted growth, dental enamel hypoplasia, and bone lesions that point to chronic poisoning and nutritional stress. Our ancestors were frequently wrong. They suffered from seasonal poisonings when their favorite foods ran out, and they were forced to try marginal plants they didn't fully understand. There are archaeological sites where mass groups of people appear to have suffered from the same nutritional collapse, likely due to a misidentification of a staple crop during a drought. The Safe Food Map wasn't a finished document, it was a work in progress that was constantly being updated by tragedy. We are simply the descendants of the lucky ones, the ones who had the most conservative grandmothers and the most sensitive tapes to our receptors. This brings us to the final verdict of our investigation. How did ancient humans know which food was safe? They didn't know in the way we think of knowledge today. They didn't have a theory of biology. Instead, they survived through a three-tiered system of defense. First, they had a biological alarm system in their mouths that flagged bitterness as a threat. Second, they had a psychological handbrake that made them terrified of new plants until an elder proved they were safe. And third, they used the most powerful tool in the human arsenal, the ability to turn a mistake into a story. When someone died from eating the wrong root, it wasn't just a tragedy, it was a data point. That death was woven into a story, a taboo, or a ritual that would protect the rest of the tribe for the next 1,000 years. We didn't solve the mystery of the poisonous world with science. We solved it with trauma and memory. We turned the forest into a classroom where the tuition was paid in human life. This is why we can walk into a supermarket today and feel so incredibly safe. Every item on those shelves is a victory in a war that lasted for 200,000 years. Every apple, every potato, and every bunch of spinach is a testament to the thousands of ancestors who were brave enough to try and the thousands more who were unfortunate enough to fail. But there is a chilling realization at the end of this investigation. We have spent so long perfecting this map of safety that we have forgotten how to read the world ourselves. We have outsourced our survival so completely to the system that if you were dropped into the same forest as your ancestors today, you would be as helpless as a toddler. You wouldn't know how to leach an acorn. You wouldn't know which bitter was a warning and which was a nutrient. You wouldn't have the oldest library to guide you. You would be standing in the middle of a chemical battlefield, completely unarmed. We often talk about ancient humans as if they were primitive, as if their lack of technology made them less capable than us. But in reality, their mental map of the world was infinitely more complex than our own. They lived with a level of environmental awareness that we can barely imagine. They were the ultimate detectives, constantly scanning for clues, constantly weighing risks, and constantly refining a body of knowledge that was the only thing standing between them and extinction. They lived on a knife's edge every single time they felt hungry. So, as you stand there in the grocery store, looking at that kale, remember the investigation. Remember the super taster genes hiding in your DNA and the plant wariness still lurking in the back of your mind. You are the end result of a million-year-long experiment. You are the survivor of a mystery that was solved with blood and fire. We tend to think that the world is inherently safe for us, that the earth wants to feed us. But the truth is, the world is indifferent at best and hostile at worst. We only think it's safe because our ancestors spent their entire lives making sure it stayed that way for us. Think back to that grocery store produce aisle one more time. It feels like the safest place on earth, doesn't it? The air is climate controlled, the floors are clean, and every vegetable is misted with a gentle, artificial rain to keep it looking fresh and inviting. You pick up a carton of mushrooms or a bag of almonds, and you don't feel even a flicker of fear. This is the ultimate luxury of modern life. The total removal of the omnivore's dilemma. We have achieved a state of nutritional certainty that would have looked like a miracle to any human born before the last century. We have effectively closed the case on the mystery of what is safe to eat. But as we have seen, that case was only closed because of the staggering amount of evidence collected by those who came before us. We are living on the interest of a massive, ancient investment of human life. Our ancestors did the hard work. They did the dying. They did the testing. They built the rituals that we eventually turned into regulations. We are the beneficiaries of a global chemical survey that spanned the entire history of our species. Yet there's a final unsettling thought to consider as you head to the checkout line. We have spent millennia learning how to navigate the natural toxins of the earth, but we are now entering an era where the toxins are no longer natural. We are surrounded by synthetic compounds, microplastics, and processed additives that our TAS2R receptors have no way of detecting. Our ancient biological laboratory hasn't been updated for the modern age. We are facing a new version of the mystery, one where the bitter warning no longer works, and where there are no grandmothers who can tell us the long-term effects of what we are putting into our bodies. We are, in a way, becoming the experimental generation once again. The ancient world was a minefield of alkaloids and cyanide, but it was a minefield with rules. If you were careful, if you listened to your elders, and if you followed the rituals, you could survive. But the modern world is a minefield of our own making, and we haven't written the safety manual yet. We are back in the forest, surrounded by things that look like food but might be something else entirely. And this time, we don't have the luxury of 100,000 years to figure out the recipes for survival. The next time you're sitting at your dinner table, take a moment to look at your plate. Don't just see the meal. See the history. See the cassava that took generations to tame. See the acorns that were washed in 1,000 streams. See the bitter greens that your DNA still wants to reject. And realize that every single bite you take is a connection to a long line of people who were terrified so that you could be comfortable. They were the researchers in the world's most dangerous laboratory, and you are the result of their findings. The mystery of how we knew what to eat is solved, but the cost of that solution is something we rarely acknowledge. We like to think of human history as a steady climb toward progress, but in the realm of food, it was more like a desperate scramble through the dark. We survived not because we were the smartest or the strongest, but because we were the best at remembering our failures. We turned our casualties into our curriculum. And that curriculum is the only reason you're still standing in that produce aisle, reaching for the kale instead of lying on the forest floor. The grocery store lights hum above you, steady and reassuring. You place your vegetables on the conveyor belt, watching them slide toward the scanner. The cashier smiles, and the transaction is simple, clean, and safe. You walk out into the parking lot, the bag of groceries heavy in your arm, a week's worth of calories secured with zero risk. It's a perfect victory over nature. You feel entirely in control of your survival. But as you drive home, past the manicured lawns and the patches of wild woods at the edge of the road, remember the lesson of the TAS2R receptors. Remember that the only reason the world feels safe is because we have spent 200,000 years hiding the bodies of those who were wrong. The forest hasn't changed its mind about you. It is still full of cyanide, strychnine, and death, waiting for the moment you forget the rules. We haven't conquered the poison. We have only learned to look the other way. You are only one mistake away from the beginning of the story. And in the wild, the world does not offer a second chance to learn.